Music. Some of you might recognize this. It's John Barry's music for Alice in Wonderland. I thought it would be a fitting place to start. Because
Mike, George.
Mike. Oh.
Or Henry.
Hello. Yes. Well, let's see if I can get this working. Oh, Tenniel's White Rabbit has a funny way of appearing everywhere. Anyways, I'm going to talk today about, of course, the Illustrators of Alice. I have, well, and that also disappears just as fast as it reappears, and often on the other side. But I want to cover the works of many artists who've attempted to illustrate Alice, and some very, very successful. There are a lot of them, and so as you can imagine, it's not an easy task to get all of those artists in such a short space of time. What? Oh, White Rabbit. But I'm going. Very much time at all. I know there's not much time. They told me I had to move really quickly to get. Yes, but I'm just going.
Very late, Mr. Walker. Why don't you just choose a few characters?
It's not characters I'm presenting. It's the artists who illustrated Alice.
A few artists?
Yes, just a few of them. Not too.
It's so
well,
late. And then just do a few artists. That's all you need. And then you'll be done. I have to go. I'm so late.
But. Wait. Well, as you can imagine, I can't argue with the White Rabbit. I think he's on Oxford time. But anyways, any talk about Illustrators of Alice has to begin with Jansen, because, of course, he was the first illustrator of Alice. And he did these delightful drawings. But, of course, when he finished this, he had no intention of immediately publishing it. I don't even think it had occurred to him that this would be a great thing to see in print. But when it was suggested that he print it, of course, these are very good, he said to himself, you know, perhaps he should find someone. Of course, he subscribed to Punch magazine, and he knew of Tenniel's work, and that inspired him. He liked the grotesques that Tenniel was presenting in the Punch magazine, and he was wondering, well, who do I go for advice to find out about getting an artist to do this, someone who knows what they're doing? Well, of course, John Ruskin, his friend, a good person to talk to about art. Of course, he influenced and was a critic, an art critic, and sorry, I know. Closer. Maybe I'll bring the mic around this side, since I tend to speak here and not there. And Ruskin, I picked this little quote up from the Elements of Drawing, so I imagine that this is what he said to Carol. Do not therefore think that you can learn drawing any more than a new language without some hard and disagreeable labor. And I'm sure that Carol understood that learning how to draw wasn't something you could do very quickly if you wanted to do it properly. And Ruskin, here's a picture of Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti, and Bell. You might remember Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti's work from the William Morris publication that's from the Kelmscott Press. Beautiful work indeed. Of course, oh dear me, Mr. Dodson, these days of cheap illustration, one can hardly make a volume of nursery tales or good woodcuts. Seek a professional. And this thus started him seeking a professional. Of course, he had another friend, Tom Taylor, and he had to ask him, where would I get a good artist? And I really like this guy Tenniel. Do you know him? And so he appealed to Taylor to write him a letter of introduction, which he did. And of course, this is I got this from Edward Wakeling's book, and so they were introduced, and of course, yes. A wise choice, Tenniel. And of course, Tenniel. Now, how did he go about making these images for Alice's Adventures in Wonderland? Because we all know they were wood engravings, but what on earth are wood engravings, and how do you make them? Well, he says he makes a sketch on tracing paper first, and then alters the composition, and then draws that design. But he may, and often does, complete another drawing. So he copies himself, and he often does that on commission. So that's an interesting fact. But really, what Tenniel really wanted to be was a clown. And unfortunately, he could only, the text didn't show up. Anyways, oh, sorry, there it was. There's the text. Make condition, fade out, then fade in. As well as I can remember, my chief useful aspiration was to be a clown. Yes, well, you know, Punch magazine, good enough. And of course, Dodson met Macmillan. And Macmillan advised Dodson on many of the aspects of publishing to help him navigate the complex world of how to bring text into print. And as you know, that's not always an easy task. There are a lot of complexities that you may not envision. It's not like today with desktop publishing. There are a lot of problems to solve in order to get these things done. The other thing, of course, was Oxford, which was a huge inspiration for Carroll. So the fire dogs, of course, we can recognize in the illustrations that Tenniel has done here, and of course Alice Little would have seen these and known about them and known where they were, and of course in the mess hall the turtle shells, and you can imagine Alice asking Dodson, well, what are they for? Well, and you can imagine him making a tale up. So you can see the story would have been familiar and probably told, in my estimation, many times to Alice in different ways, and suggestions of things, because all of these things, of course, are around Oxford and would stimulate, they're the tortoise shells there, would stimulate that idea. And of course, the garden, a little garden door. The children were forbidden to go on through that door, and so that would be an interesting place to tell tales of what might be on the other side. I remember being a kid and told places that I couldn't go to, which I desperately wanted to go to, and imagine the complexities that faced Pandora when she was told, you know, have anything you want, just don't open the box. And of course, where would the inspirations for the grotesques come from? Where do you find grotesque things? Well, go to the National Gallery in London, and you'll find many things to inspire grotesque illustration. And here we have the Ugly Duchess. And of course, we have here the Duchess. And you can see how Tenniel must have seen that and based his image on that, and probably at the suggestion of Dodson too. So how was this art reproduced? Now we know that Macmillan had suggested that he get electrotypes made, but we also know that Tenniel's engravers were the DL brothers. And here they are, George and Edward, and Andy found these beautiful images of the DL brothers, the wood engravers, and they did magic on wood. You could bring them any picture at all, and they could engrave it precisely to the artist's line. And that was an amazing accomplishment, and it still wows us today. So take a look at this drawing by Tenniel, and then let's fade into the engraving. Almost true to most lines that Tenniel drew. Another thing you should notice is just down here, of course, is the DL Brothers monogram. And of course, on the other side is Tenniel's monogram. And here we can see an illustration that the pencil drawing that Tenniel did, and the engraving. And you can see some differences, mainly that the DL Brothers have added their monogram here, and then in here we also notice there's the DL Brothers monogram, but Tenniel's monogram is missing, but it exists in his drawing. So I don't know what he said to them, but maybe he said, that's it, take Tenniel's name off that one. He really doesn't know a lot about lines. Look, if you look carefully, you can see there, that's missing, but where is the fan? Well, where did it come from? Because it wasn't in her hand in the drawing. And of course, and then what about these pockets? They seem to have disappeared too. And of course, from through looking glass, the dumb brother. And then the question you may ask is, so what is a wood engraving? Well, a wood engraving is different from a woodcut because a wood engraving is made with the tools of the silversmith. So an engraver uses spit stickers and angle tint tools and lining tools, and the woodcutter uses parting tools, gouges, and chisels. And so here we see a wood engraving block, like what would have been available, and you can notice that the block has seemingly 6 sections. That's because if we spin this block around, it was bolted together. The common practice at the time was to take a wood engraving block and bolt them all together, and then the artist would draw on the block and then taken back to the engravers, and the apprentice engravers would get unimportant bits, and the important bits would be left to the masters. The apprenticeship was 7 years to become a master engraver, and a lot of the work was just doing parallel lines and learning how to create the illusions that we are so familiar with ink drawings. And so here you can see what looks to me like an electrotype. And so this poses another issue. What is an electrotype and what is a stereotype? Those terms are bounced around. I'm looking for my water before my voice changes and you start hearing me talking this. So here is the Moser's tail, which probably had to be made into a stereotype or an electrotype. The two processes give different qualities, and under the magnifying glass, there are clues to either process. Now, my theory is that perhaps, and I may be wrong, I've been wrong on many occasions, that there's a difference between the two, and that maybe the rejected edition, the Appleton edition, that we can see that the reason it was rejected was because perhaps they were stereotypes instead of electrotypes. Electrotypes was a new technology, and there was a lot of different variations from it, and each printer was keeping it secret, holding their cards of how the formula they used for their stereotypes and the formula they used for their electrotypes. So let's take a look at what that is. So this here is a old film on how to make a stereotype. And so you can see here they're setting up the type. Now this is much later. This would be after the 1890s because that's linotype that they're moving there. And in Carroll's time, it would all have been monotype, individual pieces of type that would have been tied up. And so they plane them. That's the planing of it. That keeps any pieces of type that might have jumped up flat. And so this is all locked up into the chase and then moved over here for the stereotyping process. And this, of course, is important because if you don't make a stereotype of all the type that you've set up, it'll cost you a fortune to get it reset. And the beauty of the stereotype, it essentially makes a mold, and you're able to get multiple copies off that. And so if you need fresh blocks for the press, then you can get them. So again, planed down, they put the flong on top now, and they're going to run it through the first impression. And for your tactile pleasure, I brought this stereotype flong for you to take a look at so you can see some of the details that one can achieve in a flong using this process. So I'll just, you guys can hand that around and feel. It's always best to have something to bring it out of this illusionary shadows, Plato's shadows on the wall, and into something that we can understand and feel. And then after this impression, it has to go through another impression. So first, what they do is now they got to mark out areas on this, the lower areas, and they score it down and push the areas that they want to be lower in the stereotype block. This has to be done by hand. This is where the quality problem is. If you skip any of these steps, the quality of the plates that you make will be inferior. Now they're going to put another flong on top of this, and they're going to press it into this. And the reason the two is because you need to be able to release it from the mold. And so they're going to run it now through the platen press. So cylinder press, no platen press, that's a felt blanket they put over top of it. And now they're going to press it down to get a good impression. This is important. The amount of pressure that is exerted also affects the quality of the images that you get off of a flong. I know you're saying, but I thought it was going to be a talk about the Illustrators of Alice. Well, yeah, but this is part of it. I'm actually a printer, and so I'm really interested in process. So let's take a look at the other thing that I talked about, an electrotype. Yes, the modern technology of electrotype, where we're using a plate. We make a plate, so we set up the type much the same way, but instead of forcing a flong into the form, we are going to force another material, and then we're going to immerse it into a bath, and using electricity, we're going to have copper make a jump across a solution and create a solid copper plate that we can then run on the press. This gives better quality. You'll get a sharper image, but it costs more money, and it takes a little bit more time. And you've got to be careful that your form is locked up properly. There's those wedges in there are called coins, Q-U-O-I-N-S. So here he throws it in here, and now he's got he dusts it with the metal release, and now he's going to put on top of that a wax plate. And then the wax plate is then another board goes over top of that, and then they push it into the press, and then it's pressed down into the form, and this is where you get all the detail. It's really important to get enough pressure to collect all the detail out of that form. And then from here, the wax plate, and you'll be able to actually see the details of the wax plate. So that is all the type. Now it's hard, but when that flong comes around, look at there, you can see there is a lot of detail in the flong. But this is for stereotyping. And so then he hands it to the stereotyping man, and he immerses it into the bath, and now the copper slowly, over a long period of time, migrates from a solid copper plate over across to the wax flong. The wax flong is coated with graphite. That's how it conducts electricity, and that's how it makes the leap. It's interesting, isn't it? And now he's cutting, these are solid copper plates, and now he's going to cut it on the saw. Hey, where's your safety guides and everything? Oh, no gloves, nothing. Anyways, welcome to the print shop of the early 20th century. Lots of young men work in there. Jobs are always opening up. Anyways, any of you who want to be an electrotyper, please step forward. Of course, let's get into the Illustrators of Alice. I know I don't have much time. I'm going to rush through these, but I want to talk about them. Of course, Carol's friend, Emily Thompson, they corresponded quite readily, and they like to correspond about fairies. Of course, Carol's story was going to be Alice's Adventures in Fairyland, except, of course, there were really no fairies in the story, but he really admired these types of drawings that Gertrude Emily did, and of course here she is. And when Carol had written her for a number of months before he actually met her, and he was with some children when he met her at the museum, and he told the children, show me a woman who would like fairies, and that's who I'm looking for. And so the kids said, oh, it's that lady there. And so they went up, and he says, my name is Mr. Dodson, and I think we ought to meet, and that's how they met. And I thought that was very charming. And of course, she was the artist that Carol chose for the Nursery Alice. And there she is with her yellow dress, and of course, the Tenniel images were used inside, but he had modified them and changed the colors on them. But you can see the Tenniel monogram is there. Now, color was a very expensive thing to do, so you really had to make sure you're going to make some money off a product if you're going to do it in color. So that's an important thing to remember, and it was why books were printed in black and white, cheaper, especially children's books. So coloring was an expensive proposition. I can see in the bottom of that one, you can see, of course, Tenniel's monogram. Beatrice Potter. I mean, she actually didn't end up with an Alice book that she illustrated, but she did do some illustrations for Alice, and I think it's important to look at these because they're fascinating, and that she was interested in doing it. It was something she would have liked to have done, but of course it never happened. So these are very rare, but you could see many artists draw and redraw things as we work out problems within the graphic structure. We're trying to sort through an illusion, and we're trying to present that illusion in such a way that the person who is reading that illusion gains some enjoyment out of it, like the idea that a rabbit could be wearing a waistcoat, and that's a fun thing. And of course, here you can see the Bill, the lizard. Oh my God, there's something wrong with him. And I think that is probably the port from Carol's The Common Room Cellars that are at Oxford. You can tell because of the late, yeah. And Blanche McManus. Now, the interesting thing about her illustrations, of course, is that limitation of color, right? So this, of course, we've got the black, and then this yellowy green color, and the red. Now, why printing a bright yellow is problematic, especially if you use zincoids, because if you put yellow ink on a zinc plate, you get that color. So you can start to tell what kind of plates people were using by the reaction of the metal to the color. And sometimes these colors, certain colors cause chemical reactions. And in Jacob's book, which is a book published in the 19th century about formulas for printers, he talks about coatings you can put on your plates to get around this problem. So I'm fascinated with that aspect of this, but I'm also fascinated with the solving this problem, that you want to put color in your books and you have to target where those colors will be and how can you make them most effective. And also an interesting thing, Blanche is also starting to update Alice here. She's supposed to be 7 years old, isn't she? She looks a bit older here, and of course, so we see a little bit of revisionist things coming along, which are fine because that reinterprets the story for new readers. Also, that title page is reminiscent of what Macmillan said a proper title page should be. Don't have any fancy lettering on it. It obscures the purpose of the title page. And of course here, and look at that wonderful crown on the fan, and of course, Peter Newell. Now here, Blanche's work is reminiscent of cartooning, where we're trying to keep the linear structure very simple. Simple lines are easier to reproduce, black and white. I often tell my students, there are only two things happening in relief printing. What are those two things? And they all look at me blank because they're thinking, two things? There can't be two. There must be more than two things. You're either printing or you're not printing. So it's either raised and it's printing, or it's not lower and it's not printing. And even in halftone photography, that's the case. Dot, no dot. So in the case when you're printing something like this, when you have halftones, this poses a printing challenge. How do we reproduce all of the tonalities, the grayscale between the darkest area and the lightest area? And Peter Newell, along with the printer who took on this task, did an excellent job. He also is pushing this into a more realistic realm, where before the representation were cartoony and caricatures and reminiscent of even like Daumier or Hogarth, we're starting to see another push in another direction. I really enjoy that. Even this, there is some sort of a cartoony quality to it, but there's also depth in it too. They remind me of intaglio prints like etchings. So that is pretty much the end of the golden age of book illustration, and as the copyright expired in 1907 and opened the door for people like Arthur Rackham, who pushed the boundaries once again. Now here's an interesting problem that I've been discussing with many of my friends out here about the idea of realism, surrealism, fantasy and futurism, all of these isms, and what do they mean, and these movements, and what were their concerns? Because we know that this is not reality, yet there is an element of realism in it, and yet what it does is it brings a reality to something that is unreal. And that is the beauty of the illusion that the artist can master and then present to their audience. And Rackham is a master of it. He makes characters that otherwise might not be believable become almost photographic. So I think Tenniel would enjoy that element of photography that Rackham has managed to bring out, that dream imagery. And this is another interesting part, of course, even in this poem, which appeared in about Austin Dobson in the Rackham book, Enchanting Alice, black and white. And of course, he's pushed it beyond the black and white, has made your deeds perennial and not save chaos and old night can part you now from Tenniel. So that's great. But you have to remember that Punch published this, of course, and this is the E.T. Reads, Tenniel's Alice reigns supreme. And of course, here we see the Mad Hatter whispering something to Alice, because Alice says to him, "Who are all these funny little creatures?" "Oh, Your Majesty, they are your imitators." And then Alice says, "Oh, curious and curious." And here they are being marched out in front because, of course, nothing can match the impact that Tenniel had, and that's a funny thing because, of course, artists like Harry Furniss, who had illustrated Sylvia and Bruno, takes up the torch because he always wanted to illustrate Wonderland. Of course he did. He was hoping that Sylvia and Bruno would be a similar type of story. Andy and I published these. Andy got scans from the fails, and we reproduced them quite large on 11 by 15 sheet of paper, and we hand printed them on my press, so we were printing them the same way as they would have first appeared, letterpress, and we thought that was keeping in the spirit of the originals. But the wonderful ink drawings, and of course we all know that Furness was an illustrator for Punch magazine. Twinkle, twinkle, little bat. Anyways, and get that thing into a teapot. And look at how wonderful these are. But the age of Alice, she looks kind of older than 7, I would think. But fabulous stuff anyways. And this is the portfolio that we published the Harry Furness images in. And Betsy Gutman. And look at how now Alice has now got a white dress, and she's gained some weight and lost some years. But what I don't understand, I like these, I think they're charming, but what I don't understand is why would you set, like, using that black letter script at the bottom? I don't understand that. I would have erased that. I think that was a bad idea. Legibility, please. I know what you're going to say. Don't mistake communication, legibility for communication. But I know, sometimes the picture tells the story. We don't need anything else. But sometimes it just is frustrating when it's supposed to be legible, and it's not. So I don't know why they chose that text. But this is fun. And the all-white. The all-white little dress, completely redesigned. And of course, the fashions of the day dictate a lot of what that character is going to look like, how that artist is going to approach that topic. And it renews the story for a new generation. So all of these things are important to remember when looking at artwork historically. And of course, the introduction of color becomes more popular because it becomes cheaper to do. And we know that children delight in colorful things, and what good is a book without picture, etc. But these are very charming, the Maria Kirk images. But what's funny here is her yellow dress on the inside of the book, and her red dress on the outside of the book. I blame that on the publisher. I'm sure the artist wouldn't want that, but when you're limited to only a few colors on the cover, this is where it is. Often the decisions that are made in images have nothing to do with the artist who created them, and more to do with the printer and publisher saying, yeah, well, what's the cheapest way we can do that? Like, how many colors can I have? Oh, okay, if I can only have 2, what are the best colors to put on that? And if I print yellow on that, what will it look like? Oh, it'll be eaten away because, of course, the texture of the binder's linen, the color of that would come through, and so you wouldn't be able to print yellow. So why bother? So I would say that would probably be the reason that we see this in red and the green. The green may have been an attempt to print yellow just to show the customer that was a bad idea. Yeah, we often do that. It's like, oh, okay, you don't believe me? Okay. You think it'll look like yellow? Okay, let's do it. And they're like, trust me, I think it looks like yellow on the press. Go for it. No, not even today. Unless, of course, you do a foil stamping technique, you get an opaque yellow. Most offset inks and letterpress inks are semi-transparent. Maybank, look at these ink drawings. They're almost so convoluted that it takes your brain a few minutes to figure out where the image is. And I like that. That's kind of playful. That's making me work for the image. I like that notion of that you're not just given it. And of course, there are a lot of lines in this. This is not so much. There's a bit of cartooniness in it, but there's so much complexity in the line that it pushes it out of that realm, in my mind. And Walker, and again here, I think this is a good use of minimal colors on the cover. I think they did a great job here. And of course, they figured out how to print white on a binder's linen, which is not easy. This is a foil stamping technique where it's, and so is the gold lettering on that. That's all foil stamping. But here, in some of these editions, you'll notice the registration is slightly off, and that has to do with what we call the wobble on the press. Is sometimes things can get off by a 32nd or 16th, which you can actually see, and we call the correction for this trapping. If you ever see that on your computer when you're trying to print something, adjust the trapping and you can actually give it a number. But we used to have to do that by hand. And then Roundtree's work. It's great. And of course now we've got foil stamping happening as foil stamping becomes a popular solution for covers. It gives it a sense of value because it looks like gold foil, but it's not. It's gold, but it's actually a brass. And this is wonderful. Now we're getting richer colors and on the covers, and this is because ink technology is changing too. These are wonderful images, and of course, of course now the reproduction of the images become more complex as we create better papers for printing full color on. So if you're going to do full color in letterpress and relief, you want to have a coated stock. And how you do that is you add clay to the paper pulp, and it becomes super smooth, and then you can print fine halftones on it. And that's how you can get these full color images using the CMYK process. And that's how Roundtree was able to get all of this, this detail printed at the printer. Because of course you're always faced with the limitations of the technologies that you have in front of you. And an artist creating for print production has to have these things in mind. And Sowerby, wonderful. And Alice has now got a purse. She's upgrading. Her mom's giving her money. Things are looking great. Gonna go Wonderland shopping. And these guys must be the ones who own the store. It's always 6 o'clock, always time for tea. And I just love how colors change in some illustrations from the cover and from the inside of the book. And this is great. Oleg was talking about analogous colors too, and it's interesting. It's on the press sometimes things get muddied and they just become analogous because of that's the way it is. The reds and blues mixed together. But now you're starting to see 1907. You see haircut style changes. Style changes in the fashions are being echoed in the work too, like. The dress now seems to have a printed pattern on it. And of course, we're just referencing the notion of flowers. It seems that we don't have to actually show you what a flower looks like because you know what it is. Just a mere shape inspires that in your imagination. So we're allowing the viewer to take that up into their minds and make things up. Now this, of course, becomes very, very dark inside. I find this one of the darkest illustrations and is foreshadowing things to come with Alice. And Frank Adams, and of course the bright colors in this, and you can see that echoed on the cover of the book too. And now you see they've resolved this problem of having the two marry each other so that they're not vastly different. But Alice has got a green dress and a red head now, and she's grown up a bit. Probably fitting that she ages a bit, and I think she had a hat on. And Pogany, again, great stuff. I like these because these you can see the style changes. It's definitely, she looks very much like a flapper, but she looks like a teenager now. And this, so, and I love this, and very simple lines. I like that, and this is referencing that whole comic book thing too that's coming up, as people are being influenced by that, seeing that linear drawings, simple line drawings are easy to reproduce. Children love to copy things. It's how you learn how to draw. It's certainly how I learned how to draw, was looking at something saying, oh, I don't know, I think I can draw those lines. So first tracing is a good way to find out how lines cause illusions to happen. So how putting a few lines together can make you think, oh, that's a face. And all it is really two dots and a line. And of course, this too is very reminiscent of things to come. Okay, now the beginning of the modern era, and of course, Mervyn Peake and an angry White Rabbit, you know, follow me down a rabbit hole, yeah. Wow. And more madness at tea. But doesn't this remind you of Beatrice Potter?
Yes.
And so, and yet, you know, that it's peak. It's just, I just find that interesting how he must have been familiar with her work, but so why does it seem to look so much like that? And of course, now we move into a huge leap when we see the work of Mary Blair and the kinds of colors, intense colors, and simple shapes that she's using that just pop out, and immediately our brains are wired to try to make sense of disorder, to try to rationalize shapes into places, whether they're hallways or looking in the dark foreground of this. Really does make us look at the center of the yellow. So we're drawn into the image, and so Blair really understood how to use color more than anything else to grab you and to pull you into the image. And also the scale, like the flowers in this are amazing, but they're very much two-dimensional too. So playing with that notion of the planes in art, and of course this is what Disney, of course, ended up working with when he saw Mary Blair's stuff. He realized that he had something that was very reproducible in film. And that's important too. And another artist who I like is, of course, Jansen's Alice. And these are very much, they have a cartoon quality to them. They have simple lines, but they're also, there's a complexity to them, but the shapes are very interesting as well. And I love how the line work here that the Cheshire Cat's head's poking out of. So I find these a lot of fun. And many other people do. And I was always curious about the bats. Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder where you're at. There's a lot of bats in the sky, I wonder why. That kind of thing. Fun. And, of course, everybody knows this guy. Ah. Chocolat. He did a whole series of commercials in the 1950s, and that are wonderful. But of course, we are interested in him because he illustrated Alice, and he is a surrealist. And so what was he getting at when he took on the task of illustrating Alice in Wonderland? Because he has an entirely different approach to it. Is he staying close to the story? No. And so is it dream imagery? Yes. But one of the interesting things about surrealism is that it is taking the reality of the story and changing it into the surreal, pushing it beyond the frame of the story itself and into something much, much deeper. One would say, I would think that Dali would argue that he is exploring something else. And in the story, because he's echoing his own work. He's echoing this girl with the skipping rope, of course, appears in some of his paintings, his earlier paintings. And so he is using Alice in Wonderland merely as an entry into something else, into another surreal, it's not fantasy. If it's fantasy, perhaps we might change the shape of Alice, we might change her dress, and it be how I might imagine it. But when I make it surreal, I take the story and I make it mine. I change things. I suppose that means that any of us can take the Alice story and we just tell it the way that we feel that it should be told, in a different dimension, in one that is both in this world and of the dream world. Yes, the Twilight Zone, you know, that kind of thing. Yes. Oh, and then, of course, the 60s, of course, we end up with Ralph Steadman. And Ralph published his Alice in 1968, and it was he took Alice. You could almost say that he made it surreal, but he thought, no, it's not surreal, it's political. This is a political story. We have to understand our world around us, that it is like a wonderland, and it's nuts. It's all nonsense. And Ralph, who I work with, this is a poster that he did for me. I designed the American edition of Alice in 2005, I think it was, and I worked with Ralph. I took all of his images and I restored everything so that we could do our own edition, a new edition of Alice. And Ralph sent me that picture of himself in the top hat. And of course, these are Union cards. Of course they're Union cards, you know. Well, yeah, oh, you don't color, the roses aren't supposed to be red, they're yellow. Like, follow the books, doesn't work the rule. No, but the boss says you paint them red. Anyways, I got Ralph to sign my books. He forgot that he signed this for me already, and he signed it to me twice, but this is one of the sketches he did for me in the front of the cover, and this is the other one, but this one was a discarded library book, and he did this at the back, which I thought was great. It's withdrawn. Yeah. Well, that's fun. I love Ralph's approach to Alice. It's fun. I love his line work. I love the splatteriness of it. I love how it's part of that whole 60s culture. And you know, the turn on, tune in, drop out. I'm getting this quote wrong, I know. But it is Timothy Leary. And I like how the culture of the 60s picked it up as part of that. And of course, everybody knows about Jefferson Airplane and the rest of it, and of course. But Stedman sees this as something a little bit more different. He sees he says the Hatter, he is unpleasant human side of nature, the game show host who reels off endless unanswerable riddles and asks you to come back next week and make a fool of yourself again. So I find that's a lot of fun. And that's Ralph and I having a lot of fun. And Barry Moser. I love Barry Moser's got a dark approach to it as well. But he's a wood engraver, and I have a bias towards wood engravers because I'm one, and people who appreciate hand printing. And Barry wrote the introduction to my book, The Woodcutter's Handbook, and I just love his approach to the Alice. And Scott McCown, another Canadian. And he does scratchboard, which has the same sensibility as wood engraving, but is a different process altogether. But I love his Alice characters because I find them also dark and fascinating. And then I wanted to quickly, if I may, just go through my adventures in Wonderland, because I illustrated Alice's Adventures in Wonderland through Looking Glass many years ago in order to get a free lunch. And that worked out for me. These two gentlemen, of course, many of you remember Joseph Brabant. He and Bill Poole convinced me that I should illustrate Alice in Wonderland, because Bill Poole would hand set all the type, and we would hand print Alice's Adventures in Wonderland from scratch. And I did 96 wood engravings for the one book and 94 for the other. And that was the birth of the Cheshire Cat Press. And that's what I look like. I was younger, and I thought that, wow, this is great. I get to illustrate Alice in Wonderland and use the iron press. So it was fun. So that's the New and Improved Albion from 1893. So it's fun using like historic equipment to reproduce things. It's sort of like one foot in the past and a foot in the future. And I love that notion of it. So all the images were engraved onto the end grain of Canadian maple, because we wanted to be able to say we did the first Canadian edition illustrated by a Canadian. And so part of that was using materials from Canada. So Canadian maple, and that's my spit sticker there. If you ever wondered what a spit sticker looked like, there it is. And I thought, it took 10 years to carve all the blocks. I would draw in ink on the block, and of course everything has to be backwards on the block, so it prints forwards. So this is dyslexia as a skill. And I thought I would just show you me at work engraving a block here with some hip music. And so you can actually see me using the spit sticker and how the wood curls up in front of it. Now, you don't have to go really deep to get a white line, and wood engraving is often called the art of the white line, because everywhere that you remove a piece of the material, you have a white space, and then what's left is the black space is going to print. And so it's a lot of little picking away at a piece of wood. I often say I scratch pictures on the wood, and my wife will tell you that our son said to her at one point, "When's Dad going to stop scratching on wood and get a real job?" There I am. Now I'm going to throw it on the press. This is my Vandercook SP15, and I just plop it in there and lock it all up, put some ink on the press, and And then once I turn on this has a motor so that the rollers will even out the ink, so I get an even film of ink over the surface of the block. And then I can pull an impression off of it. So it's inked as I feed the paper through, and then the paper's released at the end of it, and that's the impression of it. So that's a first impression, and then I would go back into it, and I would engrave some more. Whoa. I just wanted to show you that there's the California job case. That's how we set all the type for the book. And we locked up a page and ran out of type, threw it back in the case, reset another page, printed that, threw it back in the case. So there's no going back. Once we did 177 copies, and that was it. And we printed directly from the blocks, no stereotypes, no electrotypes. So if there was a little anomaly in the paper that dinged the block, that became part of the edition. And so we did 177 copies of the book. I did Joe took 66 or 65, and I did, and so did Bill Poole, and we all did different bindings on them. So I just quickly wanted to go through some of these bindings that I did. Each one I would approach differently, and this is we also did one on handmade paper. Don Taylor did the binding of this. It has a music box inside it. And this is through Looking Glass, also on handmade paper. It has a chess game. And then that's chapter 1 with the engravings in place. And I did some Coptic binding. I'm an amateur bookbinder too. Although I've been binding hundreds of books, I'm still amateur because I try to do something different every time rather than just stick to the program. And some of my experiments fail. And some of them work out. So I thought it would be fun just to show you a few of these. And Claire and August know about this one. And this one has, you open the door, and that's the garden that Alice goes into. And so I did this little watercolor painting, and there's the key down there. So for each one, I do something different. And Joe encouraged me to try to illustrate things that other artists hadn't done. So I wanted to tackle the toph, you know, something between a corkscrew and a badger. It's my impression of that. And we have some of these out for sale if anyone's interested. A is for Alice, and this is a reproduction of the Alice Wonderland book that we did that we sold out long ago. And I think, oh yes, there's this too. This my friend shot this of me after we did the A is for Alice book. Madness, absolutely madness. Anyways, I would like to thank you all for listening to me. I hope I didn't take up too much time. Don't forget to go out and see Tanya and Oleg's work too, which we brought it out there. Because they were presenting today, I didn't include them in the talk. Thank you. Are there any questions?
If you goof up with the spit thing, can you fill any wood back in and correct it ever?
So that's a good question. If I make a mistake when I'm engraving, can I fill it in? The answer is I could try. And of course, we know from the Tenniel blocks that you could drill out a portion of it and put a plug in and then sand that and then engrave it. It seems like a lot of work to me. I've tried it. I've done different things, but there's always evidence. If you put it under a loop and look closely at it, you can see where corrections have been made on blocks. And I often look for hairlines in blocks too, because they sometimes separate on the press and you can see a white line that goes through the image, and that's another way that you can tell. But errors are troublesome to fix, so try not to make them, is what I say. Are there any other questions? Yes?
Very different artistic style from either Scott McCowan, who you mentioned, and
yes.
You also mentioned Moser, and all of you are working in similar media.
Yes.
So how do you define your artistic style as opposed to the medium that you're using?
I'm an expressionist. I'm a mad expressionist. I scratch things out of wood. I like that spontaneity, and I like things to happen quickly. I like to see results, and so I do a lot of engravings as opposed to a few. And Moser's very methodical, and so is Scott McCowan. They have, I would say, they're calmer. and they're not manic artists. I enjoy getting some energy in there, and I'm always wondering, well, how can I get this energy onto the block? Because you have to remember that after photography, what is the role of the artist? Mazarel said the artist was to be a witness to their time, but also a witness to themselves, their own emotional responses. I'm like the abstract expressionist, I'm trying to get in touch with the unconscious mind, those things. There's some of myself in all of those images, but also because I did these engravings over a long period of time, there is a transformation in me too. I change. I'm not the same person I was when I started than when I finished, and I learned a lot of things, and I learned how to cut some corners and to improve my technique and to become faster and more efficient in some respects. And you'll see that in my newer work. Some of it is more photographic than some of my older work, but I'm interested in that notion of representation and non-representation, and that middle ground in between those two spaces.